Hey folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is Dan Lizette. This is episode 116, and I've got a lot of great feedback from you guys about last week's show with Madeline Barron from In the Dark. If you are just arriving today and have not heard that episode, strongly encourage you guys to go back and check it out. This week's show, though, is brought to you by great listeners like you right there on Patreon, folks. If you're interested in supporting the Podcast Digest directly, go ahead and check out the link in the show notes. For as little as $1 a month, you can make a huge difference to the show. This week's show is also brought to you by Podbean. Podbean is podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start podcasting. Go to podbean.com/TPD, learn more, and get your first month free. I'll tell you more about Podbean in just a little while, but with this week's show, I've got something a little bit different for you. As you guys know, I am a huge fan of storytelling shows, and the live storytelling element has always held my fascination. With shows like The Moth, Mortified, Snap Judgment has a live element very often. I love the dynamic of somebody on stage telling a story and their interaction with the crowd, and I think it makes a great podcast format for many different shows. And there are a lot of podcast first shows that are now exploring a live format. Well, there's a newish show out there that I think is doing something completely unique in this area. It's called Two Truths and a Lie. And the founder, if you will, the guy who started it all, David Shapiro, is my guest this week. He's out of LA. He's a very nice guy and does a lot of interesting stuff. And we had a great conversation about how he set this show up and what the feedback's been like, how he finds his storytellers, so on and so forth. It's a neat conversation, and the show is awesome. I encourage you guys to hop on over, check it out, subscribe. And it is a really different format out there from most live storytelling shows, and I think you're going to like it. So without further ado, let's get to this week's show, episode 116, with my guest, David Shapiro. And folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week with a super interesting show and premise, and one I can't wait to learn more about. And I hope you feel the same way. So I'd like to welcome to the Podcast Digest for the first time ever here on episode 116, David Shapiro. Welcome.
Hi, Dan. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining me. And your show, Two Truths and a Lie, really interesting premise, kind of a spin on a couple of different other shows out there, but you definitely have a unique angle. And for folks who haven't heard about it, I think you're going to like what you hear. But before we jump into that, Dan, if you could take a few minutes, tell people a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, just on the peninsula out there. I kind of always was into acting and performing, and grew up sort of in that world, and sort of around those types of people, and always was really fascinated by the idea of creativity and doing something in a creative way, and what inspires to people to do that kind of stuff. Went to school out in San Diego at UC San Diego. Did a couple of weird jobs out there. I worked on a double-decker bus tour, kind of telling people stories of San Diego out there, kind of fell in love with storytelling that way. And then after that, I worked at SeaWorld. I hosted the Sea Lion show out there, and did that for about a year. And when I finished school, I came back to the Bay Area, continued touring. I did Segway tours. As embarrassing as that may be. And
you really love the tourist industry, I see. Right?
Yeah, well, my mom and now my dad as well, too, now that they're sort of in semi-retirement, my mom started as a travel guide, a tour guide, and did that kind of stuff, and they're still doing that up in the Bay Area, leading like wine tours and getting people excited about all that kind of stuff. So I kind of fell into it that way, and I kind of come from those people who like to tell really long, really exciting stories and get people involved in that way. And that's kind of was a little bit of the inspiration for Two Truths and a Lie in a way.
Just one quick question. The SeaWorld, that was San Diego, not Orlando, right?
That was in San Diego,
Okay.
yes. And everything they say in Blackfish is totally true.
Yeah. Oh, I had to ask because I was SeaWorld was part of my honeymoon, and then I was going to have to compare dates
Oh, really?
and see if I accidentally, had heard you work at one point, because I think I saw a sea lion show in 2008 for my honeymoon, but that was in Orlando.
I think it's the same dumb premise in all of their parks, where it's just, I'm a goofy guy and here's a couple of sea lions, and it was basically a bunch of that and as much stringing together of bad dialogue as possible to form maybe 30 minutes of entertainment, according to some people.
Well, I'm sure it all comes together to justify the ticket price eventually, right?
Eventually,
it's not overpriced
yeah.
at all. No.
No, of course not.
But one of the things you say on your website, Dan, that I really was attracted to when I started to dig a little bit more about the other things you do is love of microphone. And the descriptions of what you've done prior pretty much all involved a microphone as well. Where do you think this all came from for you?
I like talking and I like being heard and I like the attention that brings, I guess, if I'm being totally honest. But I like the idea that, you have this little device and you can, be sitting in your closet or sitting, on top of a bus and you can make people hear you. And it's kind of a powerful device. And I really like the idea of, giving people a voice and making, their stories be heard and amplifying as much as possible. And I think, the microphone has the power to do that in a way that really excites me.
I completely understand, and I know right where you're coming from. I've talked about my love of the microphone for a very long time.
Yeah.
Just your 2 cents before we jump in. And I think I'm making a habit here lately, listeners, and you guys are probably noticing, and jumping into tangents early in conversations at this point. But I've talked about this before with other guests. I, like you, also have that microphone-based passion. But as you are well aware, there are so many people where that's the scariest device in the whole world, right? They wouldn't want to go anywhere near it. Why do you think that people are wired so differently? And what are some of the things you tell people that find themselves in a situation where they have to speak on one and have that fear?
Yeah, I don't think people are wired differently. I think everybody sort of has that fear, but it's the amount of exposure you have to being on a microphone that at a certain point you just get used to it. Like I do a lot of voiceover, and people often ask me, like, is it weird to hear yourself? And I mean, I've been sitting doing audiobooks and voiceover and podcasts for so long at this point that really, yeah, I mean, it was weird a little bit at the beginning because your voice doesn't sound the same way when you hear it, played back to you. But you get over it. Like, you realize that that's the reality. And I think if for those people who are a little bit more timid about being in front of a microphone, it's just do it 5 or 6 times. And eventually those butterflies in your stomach kind of go away. One of the things that I love about doing on my show is that, I get people who do a lot of stories and are actors and performers in some way, or, hardened storytellers. But then every once in a while, I get somebody who has never gotten up and told a story before. And there's a certain energy there that's a little bit more exciting and it's a little bit more alive. And, that less rehearsed idea that, when you stick somebody and, take them fish out of water, you get a really exciting premise and really, really cool scenarios come out of that.
And there's an authenticity, right? As a microphone vet, like me, I want to worry. I always have in the back of my head when I'm using a microphone, whether it be for the show or I also do audiobooks or as a mobile DJ. I'm always thinking to myself, am I losing authenticity due to this common relationship I have with that microphone? But with somebody who maybe a first timer or doesn't have that, I think as a listener, that authenticity oftentimes will come through. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I find myself going into those moments, especially when I'm doing voiceover for, like, I do a lot of, like, product videos for apps I find myself doing, where it's like, we're a complicated company. We don't know what the hell that we're doing, but here's a cartoon with a friendly voice to tell you all about it. It's always the same format, too. It's like, you have a problem. This is taking too much of your time or money. Well, we found the solution.
That sounded great.
Thanks. Did I get the role?
Yeah, exactly. It's I don't know. It's funny because I'm just so stooped in a familiarity and a comfort level with the microphone. I always love to talk about it because I know, like my wife, for example, you would have to literally put her feet to the flames before she would ever go near one. And she's not that unusual. There's a lot of people that feel that way, and I've always felt enthralled by that idea. It just doesn't make a whole bunch of sense to me, but
yeah.
Anyways, moving on, people on a microphone. So you mentioned it, and that's a roundabout way of sort of highlighting some of these other things that you do. Voiceover work, audiobooks, SeaWorld, all this. How does this path lead to the first germination of the idea for Two Truths and a Lie?
Oh, I have no idea, to be honest. The idea kind of started out as something entirely different. I was thinking of it more originally, just idle thoughts, because I've been a podcast fan for, a decade at this point, and I live in Los Angeles now, and the joke is where's your podcast? Everybody's got a podcast out here, and most of them don't really have any idea behind them or any premise or preparation or editing or anything, and I knew that I didn't want to do anything like that. So obviously, like, my idle thoughts went into the exact opposite, which is super prepared and super, scripted. The idea originally was to do something more like This American Life and make it kind of like a narrative where you get two true stories that are totally true. You get a reporter out there and, find this great story. And then you get a group of actors and you do a third thing that's entirely made up, and to try to see if you could blend those and make them so indistinct from each other that the audience doesn't know which is true and which is false. And I work at Angel City Brewery, where we record Two Truths and a Lie. And they were looking for more content. They were looking for, we've got a big space and a big stage, thankfully, right in the heart of downtown LA. So they wanted content. And I said, give me half an hour. And I was actually on the clock during that time. I was talking to a couple of friends of mine, and I said, I got it. I'll just take that idea and turn it into a storytelling show, which is another one of my passions that I've always been, fascinated by, about that enrapturement, if that's a word, that people get when they hear a good story. And I wanted to kind of play with the idea of not telling you it was true, playing with that idea of the suspension of disbelief, because even when we're, being given stories that we assume are true, the idea never even pops into our head most of the time that it could be false, which is, when you can get scandals like what happened with Mike Daisy on This American Life, when nobody questioned whether it was true or not. I like the idea of questioning it at all times, because I catch myself even when I'm editing these stories and when I'm putting the show together. And, I've told these people, hey, I want you to tell a lie on this show. I know from the very beginning it's a lie, but you still find yourself imagining it as a true story. Like, in your head, it's still indifferent from a true story. So there's a very interesting psychology behind it that I've really enjoyed kind of playing around with and watching and exploring, as audiences get to play around with it as well.
So you're working at the brewery, and they're looking for content, and if I've read correctly, is it once a month you guys do this?
Yeah, we do it every third Sunday.
Gotcha. Once a month. And so they've given you the stage to kind of execute this vision. And I'm going back before the first time, right? Mm-hmm. What were you thinking at that point? Was this fully fleshed out as you've sort of just described it, or was it still sort of evolving into what folks will hear now today?
It evolved a little bit. I didn't quite know. I mean, I knew how the live show was going to work. We eventually kind of settled on the theme of doing 2 themes per night. So we record it once a month, and then we put 2 episodes out, one for each half a month as well. So I knew that we kind of wanted to use that format. I didn't really settle on the idea of doing a theme for each episode for the first one. And then quickly we realized, okay, well, I want to tie these stories together, even if it's in some small way. And so there was the format of the live show, and once I had that audio, it kind of gave me the inspiration for, okay, how are we going to put this together as a podcast? Because it is a little bit different, the podcast and the live show. The live show, it's all happening at once. It's all on stage. The podcast, we kind of go back into my voiceover booth and, have that little bit of anchoring in between each of the stories. So I like to kind of think of it as two separate experiences, even if it is the same stories told at each.
Was this all? Maybe you've already answered this, but I'm just curious because a live show is often an evolution of an existing either radio or podcast, or it's just its own standalone storytelling event. I'm thinking about previous guests, like Mortified or The Moth,
Sure.
where I think you guys fit into that same category, so to speak. But this sounds like it was conceived as this third Sunday of the month at the brewery. That's a really interesting approach for episode 1. Did that pose additional challenge for you, or when you were originally thinking of this, was this just kind of a voiceover booth recording, and then it evolved to a live show in your mind, or?
Yeah, I mean, once I was kind of given the opportunity to have that once a month slot at the brewery, I knew I wanted to make it something that was multimedia and where the audiences can feed into each other. So you'll find a lot of people that go to the live show and then download the podcast or the opposite. And it's sort of a machine that kind of works together nicely. But it started with both of those in mind, but we have evolved a little bit. Just recently, we started doing live streams on YouTube as well. If you go onto our YouTube channel, and we also, about 6 or 8 months in, I think we started doing the videos as well. So it's a YouTube channel, it's a live stream, it's a podcast, it's a live show. I like the idea of people, meeting people where they're at and giving it to them in whatever way they want. Because there's, still a lot of people that are resistant about listening to a podcast that doesn't really fit into their schedule, but they really love going out and seeing live shows. And so I try to get as diverse an audience as possible in that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I mean, some of those other shows I mentioned right now, and even Snap Judgment very often has a live show component to it. And what's interesting is, a previous guest when I was talking with the executive producer of Radiotopia, Julie Shapiro, she's talking about...
No relation.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Wouldn't that be great, though? That, Criminal is now doing live shows, and that there are talks within Radiotopia of potentially having another live show element. Another previous guest, Aaron Mankey from Lore. Lore is doing periodic live shows as well. And it's interesting, when people talk about podcasting and the growth of podcasting, one of the things that a lot of people are pointing to, and it appears with things like, whether it be The Moth or Snap Judgment or Criminal or Lore or any of them, and hopefully adding Two Truths and a Lie to that list as well, you can see that the live show element does sort of bridge that demographic divide, if you will. There may not be somebody who necessarily would stick buds in their ear and listen to a podcast on their commute, but they're looking for something to do once a month on a Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, performing live has always been my passion. I love getting an audience together, and that moment when you have 100, 150 people all separate and they turn into one audience, it's really something magical, because you're really feeding off of each other, and they kind of form this super organism, this beast that really acts of its own accord. Because if you're in that audience and you're truly a part of it, you can't stop from laughing if the rest of the audience is laughing. Once that group forms, it's a beautiful moment, and being a part of that and being given the opportunity to kind of create that and kind of form that really excites me.
If there's not another podcast out there named Superorganism, somebody is literally registering that right now, Dan,
oh, man.
from that comment.
the latent science nerd in me would be so excited to do that.
I think you may have just hit on something right there. That show needs to exist. Superorganism.
If anybody is out there wants to co-host that with me, we'll make it happen.
There you go. Let's get into some nuts and bolts here, Dan. I'm really interested, especially from the get-go. If you talk about that on a given night, you're actually recording material for what ultimately ends up being 2 shows. Even more interestingly, where do you start to find some of the storytellers?
Oh, yeah. It's been really interesting because at the beginning, it was just a lot of my friends and a lot of people who went to the brewery a lot. But very quickly, LA has this gorgeous storytelling scene. And it's really interesting because we're in the center of the Hollywood industry, and you get a lot of people who kind of inhabit that as well. But it is really this own beautiful, interesting, different scene that a lot of people are part of. And on any given night, I could go to 3 or 4 different storytelling shows if I had the energy to. But there's this whole community, and they're so supportive of each other. And as soon as I kind of tapped into that network and found those people, I was getting people saying, hey, this show was so fun. I've got another friend who wants to do it. Or, hey, you should do my other show. And then I'd do that show, and I'd find 2 or 3 other people on it. So once I found that community, it was a really big boon for us, because we got to find all these really interesting, different stories that if I just reached into my own network and the people that I hang out with, I never would have found.
And folks, let me jump in just for a minute, tell you about this week's sponsor, Podbean. Podbean, podcast hosting, monetization, easiest way to start a podcast, folks. They offer so many great features if you're a podcaster or you are one of the super fans who I know is right here listening with me to the Podcast Digest, and you're thinking of starting your own show. I want you to consider Podbean. Podbean's going to set you up with a blog-like website. That website is customizable with themes and colors. When you do publish your show, you're going to get automatic social sharing with some quality embeddable players for that show. If you've got your own website already, it will easily integrate into that. Of course, all your basic RSS and iTunes support to set your show up. You could import it from another host or redirect it if you wanted to migrate the show over. You can be set up with an application for both Android and iOS. Podbean, and I love talking about this, comprehensive podcast statistics. Stats are a big deal. If you're a podcast host, you want to know sort of how the show's doing, where your audience is coming from, and Podbean will deliver that for you. If you want to take your show to the next level, you can integrate some really neat monetization tools. You can set up episodes as premium content. It's got an advertising platform, and even utilize a patron program. It's all available through Podbean. Podbean's got a comprehensive online directory, promotional opportunities where your show can be discovered and the show can grow. It is something worth checking out, folks, and I hope that you do. And when you do, check out podbean.com/TPD. They've set up that special URL just for listeners for the Podcast Digest to learn more. And if you do sign up, you'll end up with your first month for free. My thanks to Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. Now back to the show. I've got a very good friend of mine who's actually, I don't know, could be your neighbor for all I know, in L.A., who is been in a similar game, if you will, but with stand-up comedy. And I'm curious, do you find, because a lot of the stories featured on Two Truths and a Lie obviously are funny, right? Any storyteller could have an element of comedy in that story.
Sure.
Do you find much overlap in sort of the amateur stand-up comedian and the amateur storyteller where there's an intersection there?
It's definitely a really interesting overlap, because there are some comedians that can't tell a story, that if you get them up there and try to tell a story, they'll just end up doing stand-up, and that's very different from what we're doing.
Right.
And then there's some who can do comedy and who can get up on a storytelling stage and understand that it's a separate beast and understand it's something different and perform a different act and do it as a story. I've had some great people who probably would call themselves comedians before storytellers, but tell a really true story, with a beginning, middle, and end rather than just doing bit. But yeah, I think the really interesting thing, though, is the people who don't think that they're either and who get up there and surprise themselves. I got a friend of mine, his name's Roger, and he did a story about basically getting mugged. And he had never been on stage before. He had never told stories in that way. But he told me this story. He was just like, "Oh, you like storytelling? Let me tell you this one." Not even thinking that I wanted to have him on the show. And I was like, "Dude, you're getting up on stage." He's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And he was like, "No, you're getting up on stage and doing it." And he killed it. He gave me the best compliment I ever got, which was the night afterwards. He went there with a girl, which I would never recommend, going on a date to a show that you're in. But the day afterwards, he gave me the best compliment ever. He said, "Dude, your show got me laid." So I consider that a success.
You're doing some good in the world, Dan.
I'm bringing people together.
Literally. Mm-hmm. So you gather these people, you book them, you tell them the date, the time, where to be, they come up, right? how does this conversation go? Maybe it's not even the day of. It probably isn't, right? How does the conversation go about who's going to lie?
Yeah, I really pigeonholed myself on it because every other storytelling show I know is like, hey, we're going to get 5 or 6 people together. And if you book 6 and only 5 shows up, no worries. But I have to get exactly 6 people. They have to be on exactly one of 2 themes, and they have to be either telling the truth or telling a lie. So
what challenge? No challenge.
No challenge at all there. But yeah, no. So I kind of find the people, and I always leave it up to them if the slots are open. I say, hey, if you really want to like flex your fiction muscle and try telling a lie, go for it. If you have a story that fits the theme that we're doing tonight, and you just want to do that, get up there and do that one as well. But it becomes kind of a conversation. I really love the people who, know that they want to lie, but they don't exactly know what the story they want to tell is, because then we really just get this opportunity to kind of sit down and brainstorm a lie together, and pick something out. And usually we take a couple of key details and go, okay, well, where can we go from there? And then it becomes this really interesting brainstorming session.
Now, I don't think we've really mentioned this yet, and I am jumping a little bit ahead in the timeline, but it's kind of relevant to this train of thought, that ultimately what you end up doing, at least in what we can see visually, you ask the listener, as well as in social media, to guess, right? Who is it that's lying? So my question is, though, when you're having these conversations, especially if you have to workshop it with them, I don't know how to phrase this. Like, how do you make the decision of what quantifies as a lie? Because I'm just thinking to myself, right, you could just change the day of a week and technically it's a lie, but nobody would ever know that, right? Do you and the storyteller that you're working with who's been selected or chosen to tell the lie try to tip a hat at all, or can it just be so minor that no one would ever guess it?
No, I definitely try to. I always give them the 95-5 rule. If it's 5% true, that's totally fine. If you did really grow up in Long Island, but everything else was made up, I'm totally with it. But if it's 95% true and you didn't live happily ever after, or something like that, well, that's kind of breaking the spirit of it. And I do try to leave it up to the storytellers and give them as much freedom as possible, because ultimately I want them to tell their stories, whether it's true or not. But yeah, I think what's really been interesting is that there are different ways that we can lie. We can lie about it happening to us, or we can lie about it happening at all. One of the very first ones we had on, a good friend of mine named Tiger Moon told a story about an uprising. She's Native American, so she told about an uprising that she took part in. It wasn't true. It was a real uprising, but her personal experience in that wasn't true. So there's all of these different ways to go about it. And early on, we were I was trying to figure out and suss out from the psychology of the audience how far we could go and how much we could say and have people still believe us. But what was super interesting at a certain point, I just said, you know what? It doesn't matter. You can say anything, and just the power of being on a stage, talking into a microphone, having everybody looking at you and shutting the hell up, they will believe you. And there's a certain power that kind of plays into that. You could be saying anything, as the last 16 months of this election has proven. But yeah, it's a really interesting game. When I'm working with a storyteller, a lot of the times they'll be like, well, how far should I go? What should I do? Is this too much? Is this too blatantly obvious? And, really the ultimate goal is to tell good stories and to kind of leave that seed of doubt in the mind of the audience, have that bit of skepticism kind of born in their heads. And if they convince them, and if we fooled the audience as well, that's great. That's sort of a secondary goal. But really, it's about great storytelling.
So that was perfect segue to my next question. The audience, do they find out that evening? Is that sort of a postmortem on the night, or do they have to, or do you tell them, hey, go download the podcast to figure it out?
No, that'd be too much blue balls for them, I think. No, we do tell the audience that night. The way we set it up is we have like a little brief intermission in between each half, and they can come up and they can guess who the liar is. And we then bring the liar up and kind of do a postmortem on their story, and they'll pick 3 people to get a free pint if they got it right. So come to the live show because you could get some free beer.
There you go.
But in the podcast, I don't do it until the next episode.
Right.
And that may seem like, just a blatant cliffhanger, but really the idea was I want to kind of leave you. You go away from the podcast, you go about the rest of your week, and you don't know which is true. And so they kind of all get planted in your memory as a true story. So if you do go back, then you get to find out, but they're all in your head as true until I kind of pull the rug under from you.
Well, and I think that was handled correctly, right? Because if you did it in the same episode, within an hour or two of release, it's out there and you ruined it. Hypothetically, for somebody who really wants to buy into the gamification element of this and kind of give themselves a, winning percentage on how often they do it, at least for a week, first week listeners, or no, 2-week listeners, right? Because you guys are every other week.
Every other week, yeah.
Right. So for the first 2 weeks, everybody who's downloading, listening, and chiming in has a legitimate guess because nobody knows, except you, of course, and the live audience.
And the live audience. Yeah. And the storytellers, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's really been interesting because I imagined it and kind of constructed the architecture of the show where if you wanted to jump in after we've done 30 episodes or so, you really should start at the beginning and then go from show to show, and you can kind of, you get to live in that world where you don't know. But a couple people have reached out to me and they said, oh, I've been listening to it, but I've been listening to it backwards. So I get to know which one the lie is before I hear any of them. And I think I love that. I think it's a really interesting way to do it.
Right.
You kind of have a different psychology about that way. But
I did that once. I think it was either the first one I ever came in on, or it was I missed a week and then I picked it up with the next one. And you oftentimes unveil that in the intro. Sure. And the way you sold it in the intro with what happened, and then you usually come back and play like a 90-second clip or whatever of the person who was in the process of telling. It intrigued me enough to go back and listen to the episode that I did miss, and it was a completely different experience because it's almost like knowing the ending to something and then starting back from the beginning to kind of figure out how that all happened. And it's obviously wasn't original thought here and the original goal and what you put together, but I think it's a completely valid experience because it was still cool.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I must have watched The Usual Suspects 9 or 10 times by now. And after the first time, you get the twist.
Yep.
But the other 8 or 9 times, you get to watch for the twist. You get to play detective. So there's a certain joy to that as well.
Yeah, and what's funny is I just had this strange thought. And, regular listeners of the podcast, I just know I used to do this all the time. In fact, I haven't done this in a couple of months. So I'm bringing back the idea machine that I had been for so long. But you mentioned, Dan, that at the end of each half of the live show, you would bring back, sort of the lying storyteller and kind of do a postmortem about it. That might be interesting to include in the episode in that following week to kind of, we've been talking about sort of this discussion about what part was a lie, what part was true. You told us the story of your friend with the Native American, the uprising type deal. That might be neat to hear in the next week's episode about kind of how that came together. I don't know.
Yeah.
Unsolicited advice.
Well, no. So we basically we do a little interview with the storyteller after the show, and that's what goes on. So it's sort of just a different version of that. But
right.
There have been a couple of really interesting reactions to finding out. We had this one guy, Nathan Turner. He told this beautiful story about being in Moscow, being sort of adrift in Moscow, kind of as an expat, and seeing this Russian mobster run over an elderly homeless man, get out, and check not to see if the homeless man was okay, but if his car was dented, and then run off. And he saw this man bleeding in the street to death, told this beautiful story, had the audience in tears, and it was a lie. And they booed him. And I was so happy, and Nathan was so happy because, I mean, obviously there's that element of betrayal, but we told you we were going to betray you.
That's the whole name of the show, right?
Yeah.
Somebody is.
Exactly. So the audience was upset in the moment, but nobody was upset after that. It was just they got so emotionally attached to this story that was just heartbreaking. And then we broke it again by telling them it wasn't true. So there was this really interesting play that happens into there, and I love kind of playing with those emotions there.
It's almost like a compressed Parents and Santa story there, Dan.
What's that one going? I'm Jewish. Maybe I don't understand.
Let me ask you this. After the live show, then what? So you've collected all the audio from the evening, which I imagine is far in excess of what we typically hear in an episode. How do you put this all together?
Yeah, and this is one of those things that I hadn't really explored before I had done podcasting. I do voiceover, but that's easy to record because it's in a very controlled environment and it's one track. And if I mess up, I just do it again using my own voice that I can fully control. But it's very different when you have these elements that are on the show, and if you didn't catch them, you didn't catch them. I get the audio. It's not very heavily edited. I'll edit a little bit for pacing, but for the most part, I try to kind of keep the stories as their own because I know the storytellers, did put craft into that, and so I don't want to alter that too much. And then I kind of try to find the through line because I give them these themes, and they're usually very broad themes because I want to make it as possible a show as I can. And if I make it too constricting of a theme, it becomes really tricky. But I'll have sort of a broad theme, and then from that, sometimes there's a theme that is a little bit more narrowly defined that comes through. I did an episode on sports because sports stories can be so great, as we saw last week with the Cubs winning in that glorious game. And I imagined I was going to get these stories about sports victories and beating the other team and all that. But I got a bunch of, storytelling nerds, and so it was about a bunch of embarrassments and playing the mascot and incredible failures at sports. And so there's this a more singularly defined theme that comes out of that, and that's where I kind of build the anchoring into it and try to find how these stories are more commonly defined.
I'm trying to remember now, and I freely admit, folks, at the time of recording, you guys are 33 episodes in, 34 maybe out by the time folks are listening to this. Close?
Yeah. I think it'll be 34 by then, yeah.
So I think I've been around for more than a third, but not quite half, I think, in terms of a regular listener. Have you told a story before?
It was interesting. I when I started, because the architecture of the show is so strict, and because if somebody doesn't show up, the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Right.
I had planned 4 stories for each night. Not, doing a full outline of each and not rehearsing each, of course, but fail-safe options. So, okay, here's one that I can use. Here's one that I won't. I probably will eventually, but I'm finding so many great storytellers that I kind of want to use this space to, tell their stories and let them have the stage. Right. Oftentimes when somebody gets up and tells a story in between, after they've gone up and before I introduce the next storyteller, I'll tell a little, a smaller anecdote in between, which is kind of fun to keep the show running. But it's interesting. I honestly wasn't a big storyteller on stage in that classic moth-like format before I started doing this show. But I've been doing it now for a year and a half and doing it on other people's shows. I just did one last night actually at a distillery that's down the street from our brewery that is now doing a storytelling show. And it's just so much fun that I kind of like the fact that this is a space for other people. But I'll probably do a story one of these days.
Yeah, because I'm wondering if I'd missed one. I'm wondering if prior to maybe in early booking days that if you had jumped on there or not.
Yeah, when I'm desperate for talent.
Right. So typically I usually ask about feedback, but it's kind of a two-part question this time. What's the feedback been like from some of the people who've been on stage?
It's been really interesting, especially from the storytellers who are a part of that storytelling community, because I don't know of any other shows in LA, at least, that allow for fake stories and for lies. So it's been really interesting to see them kind of get that opportunity to, flex this different muscle. But it's kind of also fun for the ones who are telling the true stories too, because then you get to kind of live in that is this true or not space.
Right.
And I think a lot of people who get up and do live storytelling, there's always a little bit of stretching to, exaggerate a little bit and to kind of make it, more presentational, because things don't always happen in a nice, neat, packaged way. But I think, with my show, there's the opportunity to go way beyond that and to just completely make things up. And so, yeah, there's been a really interesting feedback. We've had a lot of people come on multiple times. Bill Burr, who's been on your show before, he's actually going to come on not this month but next month again. And he's one of those who, isn't a traditional stand up on a stage storyteller, although he tells these great stories on his podcast, and you get a different opportunity for those types of people. And I think everybody's really enjoyed it so far, and that's been one of the joys for me, is getting that opportunity to introduce people to a form that they haven't really done before.
Yeah, Bill Burr, former guest with Home Stories from LA. One of my favorite people in podcasting, just one of the nicest guys in podcasting, picked up by Boing Boing in the last 6 or 8 months or so, which I think is spectacular. And you're right, you hit the nail on the head. Usually, when you're going to listen to Bill Burr on Home, he has gone back and forth. Well, his current episode as the time of this recording, and it's ironic we're discussing it because I just listened to it today, was a personal story, so to speak. But normally it's more narrative and sort of him kind of pulling someone else's story through the course of the episode. But either way, it's in that highly produced podcast-based format. To hear a more live telling of something is a completely different Bill Burr flavor. And I imagine for many people, that you featured, there's been so many great storytellers that I've heard to tell their stories, and it is a unique experience, I'm sure, from even some of the type of things that you were describing earlier, like a friend just telling you a story. This is a different dynamic, not just from the title and the format, but just being live and in person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of those great joys that you get to have is you get that automatic feedback. Somebody, you tell a punchline or you have this really poignant moment, and you get to see, not one person reacting to that, but a whole group of people, and you get to hear that feedback. And that's just one of the joys of being live on a stage in the first place. But I hadn't really produced much before I had done this show. I kind of was given the opportunity and I ran with it. So I really found the joys of producing, because you can get to see these people go places that they never went and kind of push them outside of their comfort zone a little bit. So there's a really cool thing that happens when people surprise themselves, and I'm really glad to be a part of that.
Well, that's a little bit on the live side. Now I want to kind of jump over to the podcast side a little bit. How's the feedback? I'm sure you've heard from some listeners, and you've got this built-in mechanism, which is spectacular in terms of a feedback loop. Hopefully it's, somewhat of an ongoing conversation. What's that part of this equation been like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's such a crowded space on the internet now, so it's sometimes hard to hear the signal from the noise. But when people reach out and talk about the podcast to me, it's always still a little bit surprising, because it is something I do after work and in my little booth that I've made in my bedroom, and it's really kind of wonderful to hear people across the country and every once in a while outside of the country talk about this little thing that I'm doing. So it's a really cool experience for me, because I get to see that people are listening to it and responding to it and reacting to it, which is kind of weird in a little way. But, it's one of the reasons why I do it is to get people excited and get people thinking and make them a little bit more curious,
Whenever I hear from a listener, it's amazing. So, call out to all you guys listening right now. If you listen to Two Truths and a Lie, or you're about to, tell Dan what you think. He's on Twitter. Link will be in the show notes for the show. Or if you like me, tell me what you think of these conversations.
Absolutely.
Either way, feedback loop. Let's get it going.
Subscribe
folks.
on iTunes.
There you go.
Do the thing.
All that
Press
fun
the
stuff.
button.
I want to go back to the live world again for a second here, Dan. When you talk about, these crowds, the feedback from the performers, the market that you're in, what have you, and now sort of the show's evolved into, a streaming element. I wonder, have you had thoughts of, some of growth opportunities? Will it always be once a month? Will it always be, as a partnership with the brewery? Will it always be just, 6 speakers, storytellers? Have there been thoughts in any of those elements in terms of, this thing might be bigger than I originally anticipated?
Sure. Yeah. Some of the thoughts more idle than others, but I've always kind of imagined like, okay, how do I expand this? How do I keep it going? How do I, make it every 1 week rather than every 2 weeks? At this point, it really is just me and one other producer, Sam Hunter, who's fantastic and has an amazing podcast of his own, a miniseries about if the Russians won the space race, which is really interesting. It's called the Soyuz Files. But it's basically just the two of us and a couple of people that help out and support in different ways. And at this point, I'm kind of scrambling to keep it all afloat in some ways. But I've thought about doing the same show, but as an open mic in some ways, where instead of trying to figure out which is the lie and which is true, having the audience trying to figure out whether it's a lie or not. And doing something like that, I've had a couple people reach out about, hey, if you ever want to bring this to, a different city, I know a way to, I know an audience out there. So There's definitely those ideas for it, but it's going to take a lot of work and, boy, a lot of effort.
Well, and it should be mentioned, and it's one of the reasons why I'm happy you're here and I'm happy to talk to you, Dan, is that you guys are still in the the mid-30s for episode count. This is still somewhat of a new thing, and I hope a handful of more people at least come over and check this out, because I think it is a unique premise and a unique listening experience, because we've mentioned some of the other shows that are sort of in a live storytelling box, but within that box, everybody's doing something different, and I think you've hit upon a particular format and an approach that definitely sets your show apart.
Yeah, I really wanted to do something a little bit different from the get-go, and I don't know that it's an entirely original idea, because it really just comes from this old parlor game that we all played at camp, but giving that opportunity to kind of experience a different mindset as you listen to stories, that's really what I wanted to give to the audience, and I hope I've done that as much as possible.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed my time. I'm staying subscribed. I want to see what's coming up next. I mean, especially if you're bringing Bill back. I'm a big Bill fan, so that's for sure.
Well, good. And if you ever make it out to L.A., I want you on the show, too. I'm sure you've got some stories to tell.
Oh, well, I've only been a mobile DJ for 17 years, so I'm still a little nervous with a microphone in front of a crowd. That's a thing for me, Dan. I don't know.
We'll get you past that. I promise.
That's called bringing the conversation 360 right there. We brought it all the way back around. Look at that.
There you go.
Well, Dan, if folks are intrigued by what we've talked about here and what we've described here in Two Truths and a Lie, how do they find your that show and maybe find some of the other stuff that you do?
Sure. You can go to twotruthspod.com and listen to it there. You can go on iTunes and Stitcher and all the other things and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, you can check me out at danieldavidshapiro.com, or if you're in LA, come down to Angel City Brewery, and I am there probably drinking a beer and probably talking to somebody about beer. So, come find me there too.
So if you do have to do a fill-in story in the near term, that story might be about beer.
The story I told last night was about beer, actually, so I wouldn't be surprised.
There you go. Well, Daniel, David Shapiro, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you guys nothing but the best with this show. It's a great premise, and I love the fact that it's live, and I really appreciate your time and joining me.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
And folks, that'll do it for episode 116 of the Podcast Digest. Hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. I really did. And Two Truths and a Lie is a really unique show. So please make sure you check it out and subscribe. I think you'll enjoy. Folks, if you did enjoy this episode of the Podcast Digest, a review on iTunes would be greatly appreciated. It only takes you a second. Or a review on any medium that you listen to, whether that be Google Play or Stitcher or TuneIn, any of those places that will accept a review. I will accept it and be very appreciative of your support. If you really love the show and have for a while, I'd encourage you to check out the link in the show notes for Patreon. $1 a month from each one of you listening right now would literally change my life, and that would be amazing if you were going to consider that for me. But this week, I'd also like to thank my show sponsor. They've been a great supporter of the Podcast Digest. That's Podbean. If you're thinking of starting a podcast or looking for a great home for your existing one, you'll get your first month free if you sign up with this special URL, podbean.com/TPD. My thanks again to Podbean. That will do it for this week on the Podcast Digest. Episode 116 is in the can. 117 coming up next. Don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you so much. This is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest, and I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.